The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip across the crowded market square, and every head turned toward the raised wooden platform at the center of Duskwall's trade fair. "Last lot of the morning, gentlemen. Last lot, and I warn you now, she is a difficult one." Charles Carver had not come to Duskwall for the bride market. He had come for iron stock, for a new set of bellows, and for the single barrel of dark ale he allowed himself every 3 months. He had been pushing through the crowd toward the ironmonger's stall on the far side of the square when the auctioneer's voice snagged him the way a fishhook snags a sleeve. Not intended, not welcomed, but impossible to simply pull free of. He stopped. On the platform, chained at the wrists by a length of rope that the auctioneer held like a dog's leash, stood the largest, most strikingly beautiful woman Charles had ever seen in his 28 years of living. She was an orc. That was the first thing anyone would notice, and the last thing Charles thought about once he actually looked at her. She stood well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, with skin the color of deep forest moss after rain, a rich, living green with undertones of gold in the morning light. Her tusks curved upward from her full lower lip, ivory white and smooth, flanking a mouth that was pressed into a flat, furious line. Her hair was black as forge coal, thick and heavy, braided into a single rope down her back and threaded with small copper rings that caught the light when she moved. Her jaw was strong, her brow fierce, her dark eyes the color of old amber burning with a controlled, volcanic fury that made grown men in the crowd take half a step back without quite knowing why. She wore a fitted leather bodice, deep brown and laced tight up the front with darkened cord, hugging the strong lines of her figure. Her traveling trousers were practical but well cut, tucked into knee-high boots of worn black leather. A belt of braided hide cinched her waist, and there had clearly been weapons on it. The empty loops and cut ties told that story plainly enough. Someone had taken her knives. She had not forgotten it. She was not looking at the crowd the way a frightened animal looks at a predator. She was looking at them the way a thunderstorm looks at a field it is about to flatten. Clan-born, age 24, the auctioneer called, sweating through his collar despite the cool autumn air. Strong as an ox, healthy as a horse, and completely unmarried, the Bonecrusher clan herself cast her out, and why? Well, perhaps we'll not get into the why. The point is, she's available, She tried to bite the last man who came near her. Someone shouted from the crowd and laughter rippled through the square. "An exaggeration," the auctioneer said, though his grip on the rope tightened. "A misunderstanding. Starting bid is 8 silver, gentlemen. 8 silver for a woman of this. 2 silver, said a merchant near the front, the tone of a man buying a sick goat. 4, said another, more out of sport than interest. Then nothing. The square went quiet except for the wind rattling the market banners. 4 silver, the auctioneer said, sweat beading more openly now. Do I hear 5? Gentlemen, 5 silver. She can work a field, tend a forge, haul timber, she is. Unsellable, said someone in the crowd flatly, and a current of agreement moved through the gathered men. Look at her. She'll break your arm soon as look at you. No man in his right mind would. 12 silver, said Charles Carver. He had not planned to say it. The words had come up from somewhere below conscious thought, the way the right blow comes to a blacksmith's hand before the brain has finished deciding muscle memory, instinct, something older and truer than planning. The crowd turned, looked at him. He was not particularly remarkable to look at, broad across the chest and shoulders from 2 decades at the anvil, with forearms dark from forge work and always faintly smudged with soot no matter how thoroughly he washed. His face was plain and honest, square-jawed, with gray eyes that were steady rather than spectacular. He wore a leather-work vest over a rough linen shirt, and his dark hair wanted cutting. 12, said the auctioneer slowly, blinking at him. Gentleman in the back bids 12, 16, said the orc woman, complete silence. The auctioneer stared at her. You cannot bid on yourself, madam, that is not how. Then let me go, she said, and her voice was low and steady and so utterly without performance that it landed harder than a shout. Release the rope and I will walk out of this market, and you will never see me again, and this will be finished. You were sold to this establishment by. I was not sold. I was tricked. Her amber eyes found the auctioneer's face and held them with the focused certainty of a woman who has decided the precise weight of every person in this square. There is a difference. 24 silver, said Charles, louder this time, because the auctioneer had begun to gather himself for what was clearly going to be a lengthy argument, and Charles could see from the way two of the market guards were shifting their weight that things were about to become ugly. The auctioneer blinked at him again. 24, and 4 gold marks, Charles added. That was triple the going rate for any bride market lot in Duskwall. That was more than some men's annual earnings. The square made a sound like a collective intake of breath. The orc woman turned her head and looked at him fully for the first time. Her amber eyes moved across his face with the same focused, measuring quality they had shown the auctioneer, but something different was in them now, something sharp and assessing that was not quite contempt and not quite curiosity, but was balanced precisely between the two. "Done," said the auctioneer, before anyone could say another word, because a man who would pay triple without blinking was not a man you argued with at an auction. He cut the rope. She did not run. She stepped off the platform with the measured dignity of someone choosing to descend stairs, not fleeing them, and walked directly toward Charles through the parted crowd. She stopped in front of him and he had to tip his head back slightly to meet her eyes because she had 3 inches on him at least. "You paid a great deal of money," she said, quietly enough that the nearest bystanders had to lean in to catch it. "Yes," said Charles. "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because they were calling you unsellable." Something moved in her face. Not softness, she was nowhere near softness yet. But a very slight shift, like a stone wall registering the first crack of a root-finding purchase. "That does not answer my question," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, then looked away, surveying the surrounding crowd with cool amber eyes until the last few men who'd been staring found reasons to look elsewhere. "I am Vola Bonecrusher," she said, as if the name were a declaration rather than an introduction. "Former warrior of the Bonecrusher clan, currently without weapons, lodging, or funds through no fault of my own. Charles Carver," he said. "Blacksmith. I have a forge outside Thornville which is 2 hours north. I have a spare room with a real door and a lock on the inside which I will give you the key to. You can stay until you decide what you want to do next." He paused. "The money I paid, I don't want it back, and I'm not asking anything from you in return." Vola looked at him for a very long moment. The copper rings in her braid caught the light. "You are a strange man, Charles Carver," she said finally. "Probably," he said. "I accept your offer of the room." She turned slightly toward the market's edge. "I would also like my knives returned. They were taken when I was brought here and they are mine, and I will not leave without them." Charles looked at the 2 market guards who had been hovering uncertainly at the edge of the platform. They looked at each other. "The weapons locker," Charles said pleasantly. The way a man who has just spent 4 gold marks and 24 silver can say most things pleasantly and have them heard. "I believe the lady's property is in the weapons locker." The knives were returned. All 4 of them. Vola checked each one with practiced hands, running her thumb along each blade's edge with the focused attention of someone inspecting something sacred, then tucked them into her empty belt loops with quick, sure movements. The last one, a long blade with a handle of wrapped black cord and a small mark carved into the base, she held for just a moment before sheathing it. "My mother's," she said, to no one in particular. Then she turned back to Charles and said, "Show me your wagon." The drive north to Thornville was mostly quiet, which Charles did not mind. He had grown used to his own company over the years, not preferring it exactly, but accommodating it the way a person accommodates a bad knee. He had the horse and he had the road, and usually that was enough conversation. Today he had the horse and the road and Vola Bonecrusher sitting on the bench, beside him with her arms folded and her eyes on the tree line, and he was discovering that her silence was a different kind entirely. Not empty but full. The way a room is full when a storm is passing outside it. "You said the Bonecrusher clan cast you out," he said when they were clear of Duskwall's last buildings and the road narrowed between hedgerows. "You don't have to tell me anything. I'm just saying you can if you want." A long pause. "I know something I was not supposed to know," she said. "About our clan chief's alliance with the Greystone clan. About what he traded to secure that alliance." Another pause. "He traded the eastern hunting grounds. Grounds that were promised in writing, witnessed by elders, to the families of warriors who died in the border war 9 years ago. My father was one of those warriors." Charles absorbed this. "So he broke a covenant and you found out." "I confronted him privately. I thought," she stopped, her jaw tightened. "I thought he would correct it or explain it, or at least have the dignity to deny it to my face." "What did he do?" "He had me arrested and sold to the Duskwall market house under a false name, listed as a runaway criminal, before I could speak to any of the other warrior families." Her voice remained level and terrifyingly controlled. "It took 3 days for the market house to process me. No one came to my aid. The clan does not know what happened to me, or if they do, they are afraid." "That's the betrayal you're caught in the middle of," Charles said quietly. She turned her head and looked at him with something close to surprise. "Yes, that is exactly what it is. And the eastern hunting grounds, how many families are depending on those?" 14, all of them with at least one member who fought in the border war. She was quiet for a moment. "Including mine." Charles kept his eyes on the road. His hands were steady on the reins. He was not a man who made large speeches or grand promises, but he was a man who thought through problems the way he worked metal, patiently, with heat and pressure applied in the right places, waiting for the right moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated, an edge of something halfway toward dry humor in it. "Is that all you have to say?" "For now," he said. "I want to think on it properly before I say more." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. It was the first sound she had made that was not flat with controlled fury, and it settled something in the air between them, like the moment a kettle stops whistling. The forge and house outside Thornville were not grand. Charles had inherited the forge from his master, old Heron, who had died 6 years ago, and he had expanded the living quarters himself. One large room with a fireplace, a kitchen corner, the spare room off the back that had been Heron's storage, and a loft he used himself. The forge stood separately, connected to the house by a short covered walkway that smelled permanently of charcoal and hot iron. Behind both buildings, a kitchen garden that Charles kept adequately but not lovingly, a small barn for the horse, and a ring of old oak trees that had been standing since before anyone currently living in Thornville could remember. Vola stood in the yard and turned slowly, looking at all of it, measuring it with the same calm, absorptive attention she seemed to give everything. "It is a good forge," she said. "It works," said Charles, which was his highest compliment for most things. He showed her the spare room. It was small and plain, a rope bed, a chest, a window facing east. He put the key in her hand without ceremony. She closed her fingers around it and looked at it for a moment, then looked at him. "Thank you," she said, and in her voice it was not the small social thank you of a polite society, but the weighted, deliberate kind, the kind that means I see what you did and I will not forget it. Charles nodded and went to make dinner. He cooked the way he did most things, practically, without fuss, but with the unconscious thoroughness of a man who does not do things halfway. Stew from yesterday's stock, fresh bread from the morning's baking, root vegetables from the garden. He set 2 bowls on the table without asking whether she wanted to eat, because it was dinner time and there was food, and that seemed sufficient logic. She came out of her room and sat across from him and ate. He noticed that she ate with enormous efficiency and no apology, which he found oddly pleasing. "The bread is good," she said. "Heron taught me," he said. "He said a man who can't feed himself is only half a man." "Heron sounds wise." He was. Charles looked at his bowl. "He was the closest thing I had to family." The words came out more baldly than he had intended, but he did not walk them back. She heard them the way she seemed to hear everything fully without rushing past them. "My mother died in the border war as well," she said. "Alongside my father. I was 11. She picked up her bread and said nothing more on the subject, but the air between them had shifted again, another degree warmer, another fraction more honest. The first week passed with a rhythm that surprised Charles by feeling natural. He worked the forge orders from the surrounding farms and from Thornville smithing contracts in Vola, without being asked, and without asking permission, began helping. She was not trained in smithing, but she was enormously strong, had a blacksmith's eye for heat and pressure without being told, and she learned so rapidly that by the third day she was working the bellows and calling the color of metal with more confidence than some apprentices Charles had trained. She also, on the second morning, appeared in the forge yard before dawn, found a length of old fence post, and began running through a weapons practice that made Charles stop in the middle of firing the forge and watch for a solid 10 minutes, because it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in recent memory. All of that power moving with the precision and economy of long, serious training. She was breathing hard by the end, and there was a flush along her cheekbones, and she turned around and found him watching without any embarrassment. "You should practice too," she told him. "You are strong but untrained." "I was trained a little," he said, "when I was young." "Show me." He picked up the fence post she handed him and ran through what he remembered, which was not much. She watched with focused eyes and corrected him 3 times with the same directness she used for everything, no cruelty but no softening either, just plain useful truth. "Better," she said when he'd done it again. "You have good instincts." High praise. The corner of her mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, not yet. On the 4th evening, Charles rode into Thornville for supplies, and when he came back he found that Vola had repaired the broken rear gate of the forge yard, straightened the bent leg of the kitchen table, and restacked the wood pile in a configuration that was, he had to admit, significantly more efficient than his own. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you." She looked up from where she was sharpening her mother's blade at the kitchen bench. "It was bothering me," she said simply. But she was watching his face as she said it, those amber eyes moving across his expression with that measuring quality. He caught her looking, and something passed between them, warm and slightly startled on his end, and on hers, something that pulled back slightly, like a hand drawing away from an unexpected heat. Thornville was not a cruel town. It was not, in Charles' experience, a particularly progressive one either. It was a frontier border town that had been in the shadow of the Orc-Human border war for 30 years, and the older inhabitants wore their caution about orcs the way they wore their weather-scarred faces, as something accumulated by long experience and not easily set aside. When word got around, as it inevitably did in a town that size, that Charles Carver had come back from Duskwall with a Bonecrusher woman at his side, the reaction covered the full range of what he had expected. Marl the innkeeper looked at him sideways and said nothing. Bren the milliner made a point of finding things to do in the back of her shop when Vola walked past. Old Dunnet, who had lost 2 sons in the border war, looked at Vola with a flat, stone-gray hostility that he did not bother to conceal. And Petra Vane, who ran the general store and who was one of the few people in Thornville Charles considered a genuine friend, looked at Vola with calm, open curiosity and said, "You are taller than I imagined," which was clearly meant as a compliment. Vola, for her part, moved through Thornville's wariness with the same contained composure she gave everything. She did not flinch, did not explain herself, did not perform either harmlessness or menace. She was simply herself, which Charles was beginning to understand was one of the most quietly formidable things a person could do. It was 2 weeks into Vola's stay when things became complicated. Charles had been working a commission for a farmer named Greff, a new plowshare heavy work that required a full day at the hot forge, when Vola came in from the yard with her eyes sharp and her jaw set. "There is a man in the road," she said. "He has been watching the forge for 20 minutes. Charles straightened and pulled off his gloves. Description: Orc. Old clan markings on his arms, Bonecrusher clan, but not one I know well. He is trying not to be seen but is doing it poorly." Charles wiped his hands and walked to the yard. Through the gate he could see the road, and on the other side of it, half behind a cart that had stopped to let a pair of goats across, was indeed an orc male younger than Vola, broad and nervous-looking, with the knotted muscle of a young warrior and the expression of someone who has been carrying bad news for a long time and doesn't know how to put it down. "I'll go talk to him," Charles said. "I will go with you," said Vola. "Yes," said Charles, who had not considered suggesting otherwise. The young orc's name was Dresh. He was 21, a junior warrior of the Bonecrusher clan, and he had followed the trail of Vola's disappearance from the Duskwall market records with what Charles privately thought was impressive dedication. His hands were shaking slightly when he faced Vola, and it was not from fear of her. It was the particular trembling of someone delivering news they wish they did not have. "Cavan knows you were not actually convicted," Dresh said, Cavan being the Bonecrusher clan chief. "He knows the false registration was found by the market house when they reviewed the records. He knows you are somewhere north of Duskwall." He swallowed. "He has sent the Greystone clan's tracker to find you." Vola was very still. "Cavan told the Greystones where I am. Cavan traded them the information about your location," Dresh said, and there was a bitterness in his young voice that was older than he was. "In exchange for an extension on the hunting grounds agreement. He bought himself more time to cover what he did by handing you to the people who want that cover kept." "The Greystone tracker," Vola said. "Which one?" Marek, a pause. "He has 2 others with him." Vola looked at Charles. Charles looked back at her. Something moved between them, fast and wordless assessment, calculation, and something else that neither of them named yet because there wasn't time. "How far behind you is Marek?" Charles asked Dresh. The young warrior blinked at him, visibly recalibrating. He had clearly expected the human to stay quiet and be irrelevant. 2 days, he said after a moment. "Maybe 3 if his horses threw shoes." "All right," said Charles. "Come inside, there is food." Dresh looked at him with an expression of such transparent bewilderment that Charles nearly smiled. "We need to think," Charles explained. "Thinking is easier when you have eaten." The evening that followed around Charles' kitchen table was one of the more remarkable of his life. Vola laid out what she knew about the Greystone clan's agreement with Cavan, the details, the witnesses who had been present when the original Eastern Hunting Grounds covenant was made, where those witnesses were now and whether they could be reached. Dresh filled in the pieces she didn't have. Charles listened to all of it, asked questions at the right moments, and let the shape of a plan slowly emerge from the details the way a finished piece of metalwork emerges from raw stock, not forced, but found. "The witnesses to the original covenant," Charles said. "You said 2 of them are still alive. Where?" "One is in Falmere, one is in Highbrook near the Eastern Range." Vola's eyes were on him with that measuring attention she had. "Falmere is 6 days' ride, Highbrook is 12. "Falmere first then," Charles said. "If we can get a sworn testimony from the witness in Falmere, we bring it to the Duskwall Trade Court. They have jurisdiction over clan agreements that affect market goods and land rights. The Eastern Hunting Grounds are trade territory. They can compel a hearing." Vola and Dresh both looked at him. "I know a trade advocate in Duskwall," Charles said. "Merchant named Hess. Owe me a favor going back 4 years. If I ask him to file the hearing, he'll do it." "You would do this," Vola said, "not a question." "Something between a question and something much larger." "Yes," said Charles, "it's the right thing and you need the help." She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Marek will follow us." "I know. He is very good at what he does." "I know that too. And you are a blacksmith." "I have also," Charles said, with the dry steadiness that had become his natural register with her, "been to Falmere before, which Marek very likely has not, and I know the crossback road through the Grafen Hills, which shaves 2 days off the journey and is not on any of the trade maps." He looked at her. "I am not helpless, Vola." Something shifted in her face. The controlled fire in her amber eyes took on a different quality, not softer, but focused differently, the way a blade focuses differently when you sharpen it to a specific edge. She looked at him as if she were seeing him with more definition than before. "No," she said quietly, "you are not." They left before dawn, the three of them, Charles on his road horse with 2 packs of supplies, Vola on a borrowed mount from Charles' neighbor Petra, who had loaned it without asking questions in the manner of a true friend, and Dresch on his own travel-worn animal. The autumn morning was cold enough to see breath, and the road north to the Grafen Hills was empty of travelers at that hour, which suited them. They rode mostly in silence for the first hours. Then Vola brought her horse alongside Charles and said, without preamble, "In the Bonecrusher clan, when someone does what you are doing for me, takes on risk on your behalf without obligation, there is a custom." "What kind of custom?" he asked. "You must be told," she said. "So you understand what I am giving you." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "It means I am claiming you as mine to protect, that when we are among my people, you stand under my name. That if anyone moves against you, they answer to me, and that the briefest pause, that I am your blade and your shield and the one who stands at your back, for as long as we choose it." Charles was quiet for a long moment, feeling the full weight and warmth of that. "Among your people," he said. "What does it mean among others?" She finally turned and looked at him, and the amber in her eyes in the early morning light was something extraordinary. "It means the same thing," she said simply, "if you accept it." He held her gaze. The horses moved steadily beneath them. The Grafen Hills rose ahead of them in the gray-pink dawn. "I accept it," he said. She gave him one long, quiet look. Then she turned back to the road, and though nothing about her expression changed, the set of her shoulders was different, less alone, if that made sense. Looser. Like a bow that has found the arrow it was made to release. They reached the Grafen Hills by afternoon. The crossback road was exactly as Charles remembered it, narrow, steep in places, and heavily wooded, with the kind of visibility that made it good for avoiding pursuit and bad for everything else. He had driven a supply wagon through it once at 21, lost 2 wheels, and spent a memorable 3 days making do with ingenuity and stubbornness before emerging on the far side. He felt a particular fondness for it. "You know this road well?" Vola asked, picking her way up a rocky switchback. "Well enough. Watch the third bend after the marker stone, there's a drop off the shoulder." She watched it. So did Dresch, who was handling his horse with more competence than his age suggested, and who had settled into a kind of quiet deference to both of them that felt genuine rather than performed. They camped that night against a rock face that blocked the wind, with a fire small enough to give light without announcing them. Dresch took first watch. Vola and Charles sat close to the fire in the shared, easy proximity that had developed between them over the past 2 weeks, near enough to feel each other's warmth, far enough to be proper, though the line between those 2 states was blurring in ways Charles was trying not to examine too directly. Vola took out her mother's blade and turned it in the firelight, cleaning it with the careful attention she always gave it. The small mark at the base of the handle caught the light. Charles had noticed it before and never asked. "What is the mark?" he said. She glanced at him. "My mother's clan sign. She carved it into every blade she owned." A pause. "She was the best warrior the Bonecrusher clan had in the border war. They put her in the hardest positions and she held everyone." Her voice did not break, but it had texture in it, grief that had been shaped by years into something a person could hold without being cut by it. "She held the Pharaoh Bridge crossing for 9 hours with 11 warriors, held it until reinforcements came. She died in the last hour." "The Pharaoh Bridge," Charles said quietly. "I know that battle. My father served in the border war." He talked about Pharaoh Bridge. Vola looked at him fully. "Which side?" "The same side as your mother," he said. "Human 4th Regiment. He was 40 then. He made it home." A pause. He didn't talk about the war much, but he talked about Pharaoh Bridge. He said the orc warrior who held it saved 300 human soldiers who would have been cut off without that crossing. Vola was very still. "He knew," she said, and there was something raw and young in her voice for just that moment, stripped of all the control and composure. Just a girl who had lost her parents and then spent years rebuilding herself around the absence. "He knew," Charles said. He was grateful his whole life. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he had not yet seen her do. She looked away and she blinked, and she was very careful about it, and it was one of the most moving things he had ever witnessed. This formidable, fierce woman allowing herself the exact smallest amount of visible emotion she could justify. He did not look away. He did not pretend it had not happened. He simply let it be and sat with her in it, because that was all she needed, and he understood that without having to be told. After a while she said in her normal voice, "Go to sleep, Charles. I will take second watch." "All right," he said. But before he moved, and without quite consciously deciding to, he reached across and set his hand over hers, both of them wrapped around the hilt of her mother's blade, and held it there for 3 seconds. Her hand was warm and large and still. Then he stood and went to his bedroll, and she watched him go with amber eyes that held, in the firelight, something that had not been there before. It was on the second day in the Grafen Hills that the bridge happened. The crossback road crossed the Grafen Gorge at a point called Harrow Span, a bridge that had been old when Charles first crossed it 14 years ago, and had not improved in the intervening time. It was made of timber and rope, spanning a gorge that was maybe 40 feet across but 200 feet deep, with a river cutting between the rocks at the bottom that was presently in full autumn flood, roaring white and furious with 3 weeks of upstream rain. Charles assessed the bridge from the near bank with the eye of a man who works with structural materials for a living, and did not like what he saw. The planking was wet, and some of it was dark with rot. The main rope supports on the left side were frayed where they wrapped around the anchor posts, frayed badly, actively, in a way that suggested hours rather than days before failure. "We need to cross one at a time," he said. "Horses alone first, unmounted. They go one at a time, led from across while we stay here. Then we cross, one at a time, moving fast, no stopping." "The left support rope," Vola said. She had come to the same conclusion he had. "Yes. If it goes while someone is on the bridge, it won't," said Charles. "If we're quick enough." He looked at her. "You and Dresch first. I know the bridge. I'll bring the horses across and come last." She met his eyes. He could see her assessing whether to argue, could see the particular quality of her resistance to letting him be the one in the greater danger. And then she set it aside, because she was too pragmatic to let pride complicate a good plan. "Fast," she said. "Fast," he agreed. He led the horses across one by one, speaking to them quietly. Both made it. Vola crossed with the smooth, measured speed of an athlete, no hesitation, weight distributed, not grabbing the ropes but keeping her center low. She made it in under 20 seconds and turned immediately from the far bank, amber eyes on him. Dresch was halfway across when the left support rope went. Not slowly, not with warning, but with a single sharp crack, and then the whip-crack sound of 300 pounds of rope tension releasing all at once. The left side of the bridge dropped a full foot. Planks exploded off the edges and spun down 200 feet into the white water below. The remaining structure canted hard to the right and swayed with violent, pendulum force. Dresch dropped. Both hands grabbed rope. He was dangling over the gorge, feet scrambling for purchase on planks that were now at a 45-degree angle, the remaining ropes groaning with forces they had never been designed to take. Charles was already running. He was on the bridge before he had finished thinking about it, because that was also the kind of thing he did before his brain finished the argument. His feet made the decision and his brain caught up on the move. The structure heaved and swayed under him, and he ran at a crooked sprint, grabbing the right-hand rope with one hand and grabbing Dresch's collar with the other, and hauling with everything his forge-built arms had. Dresch came up, got a foot on a plank, got the other foot. They ran. The bridge gave a third of the way from the far bank. A long section of planking simply fell away into the void, revealing a 6-foot gap. Charles did not slow down. He planted his left foot on the last plank before the gap and jumped. He landed half on the next plank and half on rope, and the rope section he hit gave under him, and he was suddenly falling, one hand still around the bridge rope, feet scrabbling in empty air, body swinging out over the gorge as the ruined bridge section rotated under the load. Then Vola's hand closed around his wrist. She was on her stomach on the bank, half over the edge, her other hand locked around a root, and she had him. The full weight of him, 200 pounds of a broad-shouldered blacksmith plus winter clothes and belt tools, and she had him as if he weighed nothing that mattered, her grip absolute and deliberate, her amber eyes locked on his with an intensity that was more than physical. She pulled. He climbed. They came over the edge together in an ungainly, gasping tangle, and lay on the solid ground of the far bank with the bridge still swaying and groaning behind them, and the flooded river roaring its fury 200 feet below. Charles was breathing hard. The ground beneath him was the finest thing he had ever felt. Dresch was already sitting up, shaking, alive, whole. Vola had not let go of his wrist. He became aware of this gradually, aware that her grip had loosened from emergency strength to something else, and that she was still on the ground beside him, and that her face was very close to his and her amber eyes were doing something they had not done before, something that was not measured or controlled but wide open and almost desperate in the honest, involuntary way of a person who has just been frightened for someone else. "You are all right," she said. It was not quite a question. Her thumb moved once across the inside of his wrist, a single, startled motion that she seemed to become aware of a half-second after making it. "I'm all right," he confirmed, his voice rougher than usual. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds longer than she needed to. Then she released his wrist, sat up, and looked back at the ruined bridge with an expression of cold, informative fury directed at the inanimate structure, as if daring it to explain itself. "We will need to find another road back," she said with perfect composure. "Yes," he agreed, sitting up as well, brushing dirt from his vest. He was not deceived by the composure, and she knew he was not, and something about that knowledge, that they were past the point of one of them pretending not to see the other clearly sat between them like a new, warm thing. They reached Falmere on the 4th day, road tired and still thinking about the bridge. The town was larger than Thornville, a river trading center with a permanent market and 3 inns. The witness they sought was an orc elder named Gora, who had been at the signing of the original Eastern Hunting Grounds Covenant, and who was now living in semi-retirement at the edge of Falmere, running a small workshop of leather goods, and it turned out, keeping excellent records. Gora was 72, small by orc standards, and had the sharp eyes of a hawk and the patience of a person who had outlived most of their enemies. She recognized Vola's surname immediately, asked 3 direct questions, and then went to a lockbox and produced an exact copy of the covenant document. Her own copy kept, she said, precisely because she had expected something like this to happen eventually. "Coven was always too quick to trade what was not his," Gora said, spreading the document on her workbench. "Your parents' names are here, girl, all 14 families. It is clear and it is witnessed, and I will testify to it in any court in this territory." Vola looked at her mother's name on the document for a long time. Her hand was flat on the workbench beside it, not touching the paper, just close. Charles watched her and felt the specific ache of seeing someone hold the weight of justice delayed, justice almost reached. He glanced at Gora. "We will need your testimony in Duskwall, the trade court. Can you travel?" "I have been planning to visit Duskwall for 3 years, Gora said mildly. "I have a niece there," she looked at Vola. "And I would do this for your mother's memory regardless, child. She saved my son at Faro Bridge." Vola looked up at that. The amber in her eyes was very bright. "She saved a great many people," Charles said quietly, "at Faro Bridge." They stayed one night in Falmere, then turned back toward Duskwall. They took the longer road, avoiding the Grafen Hills by necessity, but also avoiding the fastest routes, which Marek would logically be covering. It added a day and a half. Charles did not grudge it. On the first night back on the road, after Dresch had fallen asleep over his dinner, and Gora had retired with characteristic decisiveness to her tent, Vola and Charles sat by the fire in the way they had developed. A comfortable, charged, slightly dangerous closeness that was becoming more difficult to pretend was purely practical. He had been watching her in the firelight without meaning to, in the way he often did now, and she had been watching the fire, and then she turned and caught him at it, and neither of them looked away this time. "You keep looking at me," she said. "Yes," he said, no apology. She tilted her head slightly. There was something in her expression that was entirely new, almost tentative, which on her face was more startling than fury would have been. "Why?" "I think you know why." She was quiet for a moment. "I know what I want to believe," she said carefully. "I do not always trust it when what I want lines up with what I perceive." "That's fair," he said. He shifted slightly toward her, which narrowed the already small space between them. "I'll tell you plainly then, if it helps. I see you very clearly, Vola. I think I have since the platform." He kept his eyes on hers. "I think you are extraordinary, and I think that has nothing to do with the money I paid and everything to do with who you are." Something crossed her face in quick succession, a wall going up, a wall coming down, and then the open territory behind it. "I am not good at this," she said bluntly. "I was raised to be a warrior, not a I do not know what to do with." She stopped, which was unusual for her, and seemed to recognize the irony of being inarticulate for the first time in his presence over something that was not a battle plan. "Neither am I," Charles said. "I've been mostly alone for years. I'm better at making things than explaining things." A pause. "But I know what I feel." She looked at him for a long, considering moment. Then she did something that surprised him entirely. She reached out and took his face in one large, warm hand, her thumb resting against his jaw, her amber eyes very close and very steady, and she kissed him. It was not a hesitant kiss. It was the kiss of a woman who, once she has decided something, commits to it with her whole self, warm and sure and real, with her other hand finding his shoulder and holding it with the proprietary certainty of someone claiming what she has decided is hers. He kissed her back with everything he had, which turned out to be quite a lot, his hands finding her face, and the fire crackled beside them, and the stars were enormous overhead, and the whole of the world seemed to have narrowed to exactly this point and no other. When they broke apart, she kept her forehead against his for a moment, eyes closed, breathing as if she had run a long distance. "I've wanted to do that," she said quietly, "since you stood in that market square and said you would pay triple without blinking." "I would pay triple again," he said, which was not the most eloquent thing he had ever said but was the truest, and she laughed a real laugh, not the adjacent thing he had heard before but the full sound, warm and a little startled, like she was surprised by herself for making it. It was, Charles thought, the best sound he had ever heard. They did not sleep much that night. There was a great deal of talking, the real kind, the kind that happens when two people are done pretending they are less interested in each other than they are, and some kissing that grew longer and more thorough as the night deepened, and a point where Charles' better judgment and Vola's firmly held sense of propriety about traveling situations combined to ensure they did not go further than they were both ready to call earned yet, though the wanting was thoroughly established and equally shared. She fell asleep against him eventually, her head heavy and warm against his shoulder, and he sat awake for a while watching the fire burn low and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, like he was not alone. Marek found them on the second day out of Falmere. He found them the way a good tracker finds anyone, from ahead, not behind, which meant he had read their route and doubled around, which meant he was as good as Dresch had said. He was on the road at the top of a long rise, 3 of them on horseback, blocking the way with the patient confidence of men who have positioned themselves well and know it. Marek himself was older than Vola, a lean, hard-faced orc with pale gray skin and the flat, professional eyes of someone who does not have feelings about his work because having feelings would make him worse at it. The 2 with him were younger and larger. They all had weapons. Charles pulled the wagon to a halt. Vola and Dresch on horseback flanked him immediately without discussion, Vola on his right, Dresch on his left, both hands near their weapons. "Vola Bonecrusher," Marek said. His voice was mild and ordinary. "You've caused a great deal of inconvenience." "I have that effect on people who deserve it," she said. Marek's flat eyes moved to Charles, the blacksmith. "You paid for her at Duskwall." "I did," said Charles. "You should know that what you've bought is considerably more trouble than whatever you imagine." He said it not as a threat but as a statement of fact, the kind a professional delivers as a courtesy before things become unpleasant. "I didn't buy her," Charles said, equally mild. "I paid a fee that freed her. She isn't mine." A pause. "She chooses to be with me. There's a difference." Marek looked at Vola. "Cavan wants you back." "He's willing to discuss." "No," said Vola. "Cavan has nothing to discuss that I want to hear. He sold the covenant. He had me illegally imprisoned and sold on a false criminal registry. And we have," she glanced at Charles, and there was the briefest flash of something between them, warm and private. "We have documentation and witness testimony that will be in front of the Duskwall Trade Court within a week." "If you reach Duskwall," Marek said. "We will reach Duskwall," said Vola, and the flat certainty of it was different from a threat, because a threat suggests you might be prevented and are informing of consequences. What she said was simply a fact about the future, delivered as such, and it was difficult to argue with. Marek looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the old woman sitting in the wagon bed, Gora, who had been watching the exchange with the sharp, calm eyes of a hawk, and something shifted in Marek's expression. Not fear, recognition. "Gora," he said. "Marek," said Gora pleasantly. "I was at your naming ceremony. Your mother was a fine woman. Sit down and let these people past." A pause that stretched like pulled copper wire. Then Marek said, "The Greystone Alliance is strong. You understand what you are starting." "I understand that 14 families were robbed of what my people bled and died for," Gora said, with the mild certainty of a woman who no longer has enough years left to waste them on caution. "And I understand that the truth is a harder weapon than any tracker. Now let us pass, boy." 2 more beats of silence. Then Marek moved his horse off the road. His 2 companions followed, saying nothing because Marek was saying nothing. Dresch exhaled with quiet force. Charles kept the wagon moving forward at an even pace, and Vola rode beside him. And as they passed Marek, she held his gaze without flinching, and he held hers, and then the road curved and they were past him, and the curve of the hill blocked the view. "He will report to Cavan," Dresch said quietly. "Yes," said Vola, "but he will not stop us. Marek is practical. He knows when a situation has changed." She looked back once at the empty road behind them. "Cavan will know the testimony exists before we reach Duskwall. He will try to find a way to counter it." "He won't have time," Charles said. "I know how fast Hess can move a filing when I ask him to." He met her eyes briefly. "We'll be there first." She looked at him with that new quality, the one that had been there since the bridge and had deepened since the fire. The focused, committed quality of a woman who has decided that this particular human is specifically and entirely hers, and is comfortable with the full weight of that decision. "Yes," she said, "we will." The last 2 days into Duskwall were long and cold, with the first hard frost of autumn settling overnight and the road hardening under the horses' feet. They made camp close and practical, conserving warmth, and Vola and Charles slept side by side under shared blankets in the way of people who have agreed, without negotiating it, that they are no longer pretending they do not want to be near each other. It was warm and solid and honest, and there was a great deal of quiet talking in the dark, the kind of talking where you say the things you have been holding carefully for years because you haven't trusted anyone enough to set them down somewhere. He told her about the loneliness of inheriting Heron's forge and running it alone, about the years that had felt like turning an endless wheel, about the way Thornville treated a lone craftsman useful, valued for his work, but peripheral in the way that unmarried men of practical occupations are always slightly peripheral, invited to events as an afterthought, never quite central to anything. She told him about the border war's aftermath in the clan, about growing up the daughter of 2 dead heroes in a community that revered the dead, and was uncertain what to do with those heroes' living child, about learning to be formidable because formidable was a thing people could categorize, and about the specific loneliness of being very capable and having no one to set your weapons down near. "You can set them down near me," Charles said in the dark, and the simplicity of it was devastating in the best way. She was quiet for a long moment. Then her arm tightened around him, and she pressed her face briefly to his hair, and held him with the fierce, careful tenderness of someone who is learning that this particular vulnerability is survivable. "I know," she said. "I already did." Duskwall at the height of trade season was a city of noise and commerce and competing smells, and Charles navigated it with the efficient familiarity of a man who has made the same trip several times a year for a decade. He found Hess the trade advocate at his office above the spice market, paid him not in favor, but in actual coin this time, which Hess accepted with the slight surprise of a man who has become accustomed to being owed, and had the hearing filing submitted to the Duskwall Trade Court within 3 hours of arriving. Gora delivered her testimony in writing that same afternoon, supplemented by the document copy, both witnessed by the court's own clerks and sealed. The court sent immediate notification to Vola Bonecrusher and to the Greystone clan leadership, as required by process, and set the formal hearing for 14 days hence. It was the 14 days that were the problem. In those 14 days, Coven was not going to sit still. The first indication of this arrived 2 days after the filing, in the form of a man named Civil a Human, which was its own information, who appeared at the inn where Charles and Vola were staying and offered Charles a very large sum of money to encourage his orc companion to return to the Bonecrusher clan for a private resolution. Charles looked at the money on the table and then looked at Civil and said, very pleasantly, "No." Civil looked at him with the calculating eyes of a man trying to determine whether the number was simply insufficient. "I can go higher." "You could offer me this building and every coin in the city," Charles said in the same pleasant tone, and the answer would still be no. Civil left. Vola, who had been in the doorway of the adjacent room, came out and looked at Charles with an expression that was warm and direct and made his chest ache in the best way. "He will try other methods," she said. "I know, so will we." The days in Duskwall were spent in a state of alert, layered activity. Vola drilling Charles and Dresch in her weapons practice each morning in the inn yard, which drew an increasingly fascinated audience of stable hands and off-duty guards. Charles spending his 4 idle hours talking to every trade contact he had in Duskwall and establishing, with quiet, deliberate purpose, a web of people who knew what was happening and why. Gora conducting what appeared to be an extensive social visit to her niece, but which in fact involved a series of meetings with orc elder representatives that she and Vola had orchestrated with impressive subtlety. In the evenings, after the day's work, they had time. Real time, the kind that does not have an immediate task attached to it, which was almost foreign to both of them. They walked along the Duskwall harbor in the cold evening, watching the trade ships at anchor, and talked and argued good-naturedly about things with no strategic importance. Which stars were which, whether the gray-sided inn near the market or the yellow-roofed one served better stew, whether it was harder to work a forge or to lead a weapons training. And it was domestic and light, and so profoundly enjoyable that Charles kept catching himself with the slightly stunned feeling of someone receiving something they had stopped expecting. On the 6th evening in Duskwall, they came back to the inn late after an unusually long harbor walk, and the warmth of the common room was a contrast to the cold outside that was almost tangible. They went upstairs. He stopped at his own door. She stopped at hers. The hallway was narrow and they were very close. She turned and looked at him with those amber eyes, and the firelight from the wall sconce caught the copper rings in her braid, and she said simply, "Stay." It was not complicated. It was not ambiguous. It was a woman who, having decided that she is done waiting for things she wants, says so with the direct honesty that is the most essential thing about her. He stayed. It was warm and real and deeply felt, and there was laughter in it as well as urgency, because they were themselves in it. His steadiness and her fire, her strength and his, the particular tenderness of two people who have been lonely for a long time and have found, astonishingly, the exact right person to be less lonely with. They did not hurry and they were not gentle to the point of bloodlessness, and afterward they lay in the firelight of the small inn room, and she traced the soot mark on his forearm that no amount of washing ever quite cleared and said, "You will always be marked by your work." "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No," she said, with the particular firmness of a statement that is also a decision. "I like it. I like knowing what you are from looking at you." "What am I?" he asked softly. She looked at him with those amber eyes, and then she said quietly, deliberately, with the weight of someone who does not say things casually, "Mine." The word settled over him like something laid gently over shoulders, warm and absolute. "Yours," he agreed. He reached up and tucked a loose strand of her black hair back into its braid. "And you're mine." She turned her face into his palm for a moment, an entirely unguarded gesture from a woman who guards herself carefully, and the trusting simplicity of it made his chest tight with how much he meant it. The day of the hearing arrived on a cold, bright morning with a sky like hammered pewter and a wind off the harbor that made everyone's cloaks work for their pay. The Duskwall Trade Court convened in the old merchant's hall near the market square, and the hall was not a small building. It had not been a small event. Word had gotten around in the way that word does in a trading city when there is a case involving clan land rights and a disputed covenant, and a woman who had been sold at the bride market under a false criminal registration, and the public gallery was full. Vola Bonecrusher had come himself. This surprised some people and surprised Charles not at all, because a man who has traded other people's inheritance to secure his own alliances is precisely the kind of man who believes that his presence in a room changes the nature of outcomes. He was large, older, with the silver-gray hair and weathered authority of a long-time clan leader, and he arrived with 4 of his senior warriors and a trade representative in formal clan dress, and he looked across the hall at Vola with the steady, assessing gaze of a man who has been recalibrating how much he underestimated a situation. Vola looked back at him with the amber eyes and the controlled fire and the flat, absolute certainty of someone who is right on their side and knows it, and has stopped being afraid of the person who wronged her. The proceedings were formal. Gora's testimony was read aloud by the court clerk. The document was entered into the record. Vola gave her own testimony, standing in the center of the hall floor with her hands at her sides and her voice steady and clear, laying out the events from the discovery of the betrayal to her illegal imprisonment to the bride market to the journey to Falmere, and she did it without performance and without drama, and it was exactly those qualities that made it devastating. Hess, operating as the hearing advocate, guided the proceeding with the smooth competence of a man in his professional element. Covenant's representative argued. They argued that the covenant had been legally amended. They argued that the amendment had been properly witnessed. Gora, called to respond, demolished this argument with the specific, detailed recollection of a 72-year-old woman who has kept personal records for 50 years and knows exactly what was and was not witnessed, and by whom, and at what time, and in what room. The representative attempted to argue further. The court's presiding trade judge, a gray-haired human woman named Corval, who had clearly seen every variety of legal theater the world could produce, and was bored by most of it, stopped him with a raised hand. The ruling came at midday. The original Eastern Hunting Grounds Covenant was valid and binding. Covenant's amendment was ruled improperly executed and legally void. The Eastern Hunting Grounds were to be restored to the 14 warrior families by the end of the season. Vola's criminal registration was formally struck, expunged from the Duskwall market records, declared fraudulent, with note entered in the court's permanent record. There was a moment of complete silence in the hall. Then a sound rose from the gallery that Charles had never heard before, not cheering exactly but something more complicated, the kind of sound a crowd makes when justice has been witnessed, and the relief and righteousness of it is larger than a single voice can contain. Carver stood up from his seat. His face was a careful, deliberate blank, which was the face of a man who has decided that the next battle is not today. He looked at Vola for a long moment. Then he looked at Charles, who was standing at the back of the hall where he had been throughout the proceedings, where he had been by Vola's design, because she had said the night before that this was her fight to stand at the center of, and he should not be at the front of it. He had agreed with her completely. He had also been watching her with unshielded pride all morning, which he suspected she knew. Carver said nothing to either of them. He walked out with his warriors, and that was the end of him for now. The Greystone alliance would be renegotiated on different terms. The clan would adjust. Carver would not be clan chief forever, and the court ruling was now public record, and these were the kinds of ropes that tie themselves around a man gradually. Vola found Charles at the back of the hall as the gallery emptied. She walked through the thinning crowd directly to him, and she took his face in both hands and she kissed him the same way she had by the fire, committed, warm, completely sure of herself, which was the only way she knew how to do things, and the people around them gave them room without comment, because something about the quality of the moment required it. When she broke away, she kept her hands against his jaw and she looked at him with those amber eyes in that full, open way she had lately given up pretending not to do. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. "I want to go home," she said. The word home sat between them. He let himself feel it, the weight of it, the shape of it, the specific rightness of her applying it to the same place he applied it. "Then let's go home," he said. The ride back to Thornville was 4 days in good weather, which the season provided, cold and crisp and bright, with the sort of autumn light that makes the world look like it has been sketched in charcoal and gold. Gora rode with them as far as the Duskwall outskirts, where her niece's family had come to see her off, and parted from them with a firm handshake for Charles and a long, quiet exchange with Vola that Charles did not try to overhear because it was clearly between them. When Vola came back to her horse, her eyes were brighter than usual, and she swung up into the saddle with more force than was strictly necessary, which meant she was managing something. "She said my mother would be pleased," Vola said, when they were riding and Dresh had moved ahead and it was just the two of them. "She would be," Charles said. Vola did not respond, but she rode closer to him than she needed to, and her knee brushed his occasionally on the narrow road, and that was its own kind of answer. Dresh parted from them on the second day, turning east toward Bonecrusher clan territory with a letter from Vola to the warrior families, a formal notification of the court ruling and what came next. He was still young and still nervous, but less both than he had been at the start, and he shook Charles' hand with the earnest firmness of someone who has had his understanding of things enlarged and is grateful for it. "Will you come back?" Dresh asked Vola. She looked at him steadily. "To visit the families, yes. When the season allows." A pause. "My home is north." Dresh glanced at Charles, then back at Vola, then nodded with the expression of someone who has put the relevant pieces together and found the picture satisfying. He rode east. The last 2 days to Thornville, just the two of them, were some of the finest travel Charles had done in his life. They talked constantly, a conversation that ran through the days and the evenings, and resumed in the mornings with the easy continuity of two people who have discovered that they have unlimited things to say to each other, and are happy to keep finding them. They argued about clan history and frontier politics and the best design for a forge bellows, and whether the Grafin Hills Road was worth the risk in better conditions. Vola said yes. Charles said only in summer. She said he was overcautious. He said she had literally been hanging over a 200-foot gorge. She conceded the point and then argued it back. They rode through a rainstorm that soaked them both and laughed about it after. They watched a sunrise over the hill country that was the color of heated copper, and Vola said it reminded her of the forge's glow, which was the most unexpectedly romantic thing Charles had ever heard. On the evening of the fourth day, the familiar shape of Thornville appeared on the horizon: the mill, the church spire, the spread of farmsteads along the valley road, and then the oak trees around the forge yard, visible from the road's high ridge. Charles stopped the horse on the ridge and looked at it. His home. The forge that was Heron's and now his, the house he had expanded and lived in alone, the kitchen garden he kept adequately, the loft he slept in. Not alone now. Vola stopped beside him, reading the landscape with her eyes. "It is a good place," she said. "It is," he said. "I thought so the first time I saw it too. Came down from this ridge and thought, that's where I want to be." "Then you should be here," she said, as if it were simple because for her it was. "We should be here," he said. She looked at him. The amber in her eyes in the low evening light was the color of old amber, indeed, warm and deep, and something preserved in it, something that had been there long before you looked and would be there after, which was what amber was. "Yes," she said. "We should." They rode down into Thornville. The town saw them come in. It was the end of the trading day, and the market road was still busy with people heading home. And Charles knew, without needing to look, that heads were turning. He had been away for nearly 2 weeks. Word of the Duskwall hearing had traveled ahead of them, because word of that kind always did in frontier country, and he could feel the particular quality of the attention the town was paying as they rode through. He kept his head straight and rode steadily, which was how he did most things. It was Petra who broke first, which he would have predicted if he'd thought about it. She was outside the general store, sweeping the last of the day's sawdust off the step, and she looked up when they came past and said, loudly enough to carry across the market road, "Welcome back, both of you. There's cider warming inside if you want some." Charles smiled at her. Vola looked at her with those amber eyes, and the measuring quality was there, and then she said, "Thank you, Petra." It was the first time she had addressed the woman by name. Petra's face did something warm and genuine, and she nodded and went back to her sweeping, which meant yes and welcome, and I was on your side all along, which Charles had known. They passed Marl's inn, and Marl himself was in the doorway, and he looked at Charles and then at Vola and then at Charles again, and he said nothing, but he moved slightly aside in the doorway in the way of a man acknowledging that a door, if sought, would not be closed. They passed old Dunnett's house. He was in his garden, and he looked up when they went by, and he looked at Vola with that same flat gray hostility he had before. Vola met his gaze steadily, not aggressively but not apologetically either, simply returning the look of a person who has as much right to be where she is as he does, which was the truth, and which after a moment he seemed to register, because the flatness of his look shifted slightly toward something more complicated. Not acceptance, not yet, but acknowledgement, which was a beginning. At the forge yard, Charles dismounted and led the horse through the gate, and Vola came in behind him, and the oak trees were red and gold in the late light, and the forge smelled of banked coals because his neighbor had kept the fire low against his return, as had been agreed. He had told her about the forge in Falmere, when they were planning. In the matter-of-fact way he told her everything useful. Now she walked to the forge door and opened it and looked inside, and he watched her look at the anvil and the bellows and the tool racks and the charcoal box with the assessing eyes of a woman who has spent 2 weeks working in this space and has already internalized its logic. "The bellows brace is still warped," she said. "I know, I've been meaning to fix it. I will fix it tomorrow." "You don't have to, I want to," she said, turning back to him, and her voice had the particular directness she used when something mattered to her personally. "This is my home now. I fix what is warped." He looked at her across the forge yard in the amber evening light, and she looked at him, and there was the forge smell and the oak trees and the sound of the horse settling in the barn, and everything was exactly where it should be. "It is your home," he said. She came back across the yard to him and stood very close, and she put her hands flat on his chest the way she had developed the habit of doing, not gripping, not directing, just resting them there in the particular way that meant she wanted to feel that he was present and solid and real. He covered her hands with his, large and soot-dark over her larger green ones. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I have never had anyone I could set my weapons down near," she said. "I told you this before on the road, but I want to tell you the other part of it." She looked at him with the full amber focus, with nothing held back. "I want to lay them down near you, here, permanently. I want this to be the place I come back to and the person I come back to." She was very still, which meant it cost her something, the vulnerability of absolute declaration. "I know this is fast by some measures. By mine it is not. By mine, when you know, you know." "I know," he said simply. Something broke open in her face, not grief, but its opposite, the quick, bright relief of someone who feared a door might be closed and has found it open. She exhaled with something that was not quite a laugh and pressed her forehead to his and closed her eyes, and he held her face in his soot-dark hands. "By mine it is not fast either," he said. "I paid triple without blinking in a market square for a woman who had been called unsellable. That tells you where I was from the first moment I saw you." She made a sound against his forehead, warm and low and undone. And then she kissed him with the same committed sureness. She kissed him with every time, and the copper rings in her braid caught the last of the evening light, and the oak trees moved slowly around them. That night they ate together in the kitchen, which felt different now, not different in the room or the food, but in the quality of the sitting, the way two people feel the difference between sharing a table temporarily and sharing one as if they have always been going to. She cooked this time, producing something from the larder that was Bonecrusher clan in construction, heavy with root vegetables and deeply spiced with whatever she found in the spice box. And it was extraordinary, and he told her so honestly. "My mother's recipe," she said, "approximately. Then your mother cooked well." "She was better at fighting than cooking," Vola said, with the dry affection of someone who has spent years making peace with a person's whole nature, perfections and limitations together. "But she tried." Charles laughed. She watched him laugh with those amber eyes, warm and pleased with herself, and did not try to conceal it. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of the forge house changed and deepened and became itself. Vola took on the bellows work formally, not as a helper but as an apprentice, with the serious dedication of a person who intends to be good at something and will accept nothing less. And she progressed so rapidly that Charles began thinking of her less as an apprentice and more as a partner in the technical sense, because she had the physical strength and the patient precision that some people simply have and others work years to develop, and she had both from the start. She still ran her weapons practice every morning before first light. He still joined her and she still corrected him, and he was getting better in the slow, sure way of someone who has found the right teacher and the right reason to work at it. The town adjusted. It took time. Frontiers do not change their colors quickly, and a small border town has long memories and short patience for novelty. But adjustment happened, as it does when a thing is simply, persistently, quietly true. Petra's welcome had been genuine and visible, which mattered because Petra was liked in Thornville. Charles was respected in Thornville, and his respect extended at a certain discount to those close to him, which was not a fair arrangement but was a real one. Vola herself did what she had always done, existed as fully and honestly as she was, without performance in either direction, and let people draw their own conclusions on their own schedule. The first real turn came in late autumn, when the Greff farm's largest plow horse threw a shoe at the worst possible moment during the last harvest push, and Vola, who happened to be driving the supply wagon past on the way back from Thornville, stopped, assessed the situation, removed the relevant tools from the wagon, and shod the horse herself on the roadside in 30 minutes, while Greff and his family watched with expressions that moved from skepticism to astonishment to gratitude in smooth progression. Greff came to the forge the next day and thanked her directly, which she received with her customary directness, and then bought a new set of harness fittings, and on the way out said to Charles, "She is better at the quick shoe than Heron was." which was the highest endorsement that could be offered in that particular vocabulary. Old Dunnet was the last, as Charles had expected. He came to the forge in the deep winter with a cracked gate hinge that needed work, and he sat in the yard on the bench where people often sat while Charles worked, and he watched Charles at the anvil and then Vola at the bellows, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said to no one in particular, "My boys died at Harrow Creek Crossing 9 years ago." Charles kept working. Vola looked up from the bellows. "I know where Harrow Creek Crossing is," she said. "I was 12. My cousin was stationed there." She paused, her hand still on the bellows. "There was a unit of human 4th Regiment soldiers who pulled 8 orc warriors out of the crossing alive when the bridge collapsed." She held his gaze. "My cousin was one of them." Dunnet was quiet for a very long time. He looked at her in a way that was different from before, not the flat gray hostility but something much more complicated, the look of a man who has held grief in one shape for a long time and is having to accommodate a larger shape. "I didn't know that," he said finally. "There are a great many things neither side knew about the other," she said, not unkindly but not softly either. "That is how the border war was managed, so that we would not know." A pause. "Your boys were brave, you should know that." Dunnet looked at the ground for a while. Then he looked up at Vola and then at Charles, and what was in his face was not exactly warmth but was the predecessor of it, the clearing away of brush before something can grow. "Good work on that hinge," he said to Charles when it was done. "Thank you," said Charles. Dunnet left. When he was out of the yard, Vola let out a long, controlled breath, and Charles came and stood beside her, and she leaned against his shoulder very briefly 1 second, no more, and then straightened back up. "That will take time," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but it started." By midwinter, the forge had more business than Charles had been able to comfortably handle alone, which was a pleasant problem to have. Vola handled the heavy structural work, gate hardware, wheel rims, plow fittings, with increasing confidence and skill, and Charles handled the precision work, blades, tools, fittings that required particular care, and they worked in the easy, efficient rhythm of 2 people who have learned each other's pace. In the evenings, by the kitchen fire, she taught him Bonecrusher clan history, and he taught her the trade record system that governed the frontier commerce, which she had decided she needed to understand. She was intensely focused and got irritated when she did not understand something immediately, which was the only version of impatience she showed, and he found it endearing in the way that people find the specific textures of someone they love endearing, not in spite of themselves, but exactly because of who the person is. She had written to the 14 warrior families through Dresch, and had received responses from 11 of them, mostly formal, some warmer. The eastern hunting grounds had been restored per the court ruling by the season's end, and word of that had traveled. Her name was spoken differently in Bonecrusher clan territory now than it had been when she was arrested. She knew this and did not perform any particular feeling about it, but Charles caught her sometimes sitting with one of the letters with an expression of very quiet, deep satisfaction. The night of the Thornville Winter Gathering, an annual event, the whole town sharing a meal in the market hall before the hardest months of cold, was the first time Charles and Vola attended it together. It was not quite the same as the night of the Duskwall hearing, but it had a similar quality, the quality of a thing being decided publicly, of a thing being witnessed. They arrived together. That was the whole of it. They arrived together and found a table and sat down and ate and talked to Petra and her husband and to the Greff family and to the miller and his wife, and the quality of the evening was mostly ordinary, not perfectly ordinary. There were still eyes that slid and turned and assessed. There were still small adjustments in people's faces when they looked at the 2 of them, but it was mostly ordinary. And that was what ordinary looked like being built, Charles thought. Not a sudden declaration, not a transforming moment, but a series of small and unremarkable evenings that accumulate, like layers of metal built up at the forge, until the shape is solid and the substance is real. Near the end of the evening, when the fires were burning low and people were beginning to drift toward home, Petra leaned across the table and said to Vola with characteristic directness, "Are you staying permanently?" Vola looked at her, then at Charles. He did not perform any expression but looked back at her with steady gray eyes, which was all she needed. "Yes," said Vola, "permanently." Petra nodded with the satisfied expression of a woman who has been hoping for a particular answer and is pleased to receive it. "Good," she said. "Thornville could use a second blacksmith, especially one who can shoe a horse on a roadside without blinking." Vola's mouth curved, the real smile, the full version, the one Charles still felt like a particular kind of gift every time he saw it. "I do not blink," she said. "No," said Petra, "I do not think you do." Walking home through the winter-cold street, with the stars very clear and the frozen ground ringing under their feet, Vola tucked her hand through Charles' arm in the way she had developed over the winter months, not the gesture of someone leaning on support, but of someone choosing contact, preferring it, making the conscious and repeated decision that this is where her hand should be. He put his hand over hers. "It was a good evening," he said. "It was," she said. "Better than I expected. It will keep getting better." She tilted her head and looked at the sky with those amber eyes, and the copper rings in her braid caught the starlight, and she looked exactly like what she was, strong and fierce and deeply, irreversibly herself, and also, more recently, also his. "I believe you," she said. And she said it the way she said things that mattered, with the full weight of her certainty behind it, simply, without performance, in the way of a woman who says what she means and means what she says, for the whole of her life. He believed it too. He believed it the way he believed in the work of his hands, through experience, through attention, through the steady accumulation of evidence that something made right holds. At the forge gate, she stopped and turned to him, and in the cold, clear night, with Thornville quiet around them and the oak trees black against the stars, she looked at him for a long and unhurried moment. "Charles Carver," she said. "Vola Bonecrusher," he said. "I want you to know," she said, and this was not the operational certainty or the declarative confidence she used for strategy. This was the other voice, the quiet one she kept inside most of the time, that I did not believe this was the kind of thing that happened. Not to me. She was looking at him steadily, which with her was always harder than looking away would be. "I thought I was made for other things, harder things. I had made my peace with that." "And now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "I think the harder thing was always this, letting it be this." She reached up and set one hand flat against his chest, above his heart, and left it there. "Letting it be easy, letting it be you." He covered her hand with his, as he always did, and stepped close to her, and she leaned into him with the unhurried weight of someone who is exactly where they have decided to be, and will be here tomorrow, and the day after that. "It is easy," he said into the top of her head, into the black hair and the copper rings. "The hard part was before this." She exhaled slowly, and her arm came around him, and she held him with the careful fierceness she held everything she decided was worth keeping. The gate was unlocked. The forge smelled of banked coals and worked iron. Inside, the kitchen fire needed banking, and the loft stairs needed a new rail, and the eastern hunting grounds were restored, and Coven's ruling was in the records, and the bridge in the Grafin Hills was already being repaired by the road crews, because Charles had filed a maintenance report with the Duskwall Trade Authority when he had been there for the hearing, because he was the kind of man who noticed warped hinges and loose rail bolts and frayed ropes and filed the relevant reports, which was one of the many specific things about him that she loved. He was the kind of man who, in a market square full of people calling a woman unsellable, had paid triple without blinking. Not because he had something to prove, not because he was making a statement, because it had been the right thing to do in that moment, and he had done it in the direct, unhurried way he did right things, and that was simply who he was. She had known it. In the 12 seconds she had stood on that platform and looked at him for the first time. She had known him. She went inside. He followed. The door closed behind them, and the fire wanted building up, and there was bread to start for the morning, and tomorrow was a full day at the forge, and none of it was small or insufficient or ordinary in the diminished sense. All of it was the full, warm, hard-worked, deeply wanted life that neither of them had believed they would have. It was theirs. They had paid for it in their own specific currencies, she in courage and truth-telling and the willingness to be seen, he in steadiness and decency and the singular moment of unblinking certainty in a market square, and it was real and it was solid and it was theirs, and it would hold. The way a good weld holds. The way a well-made hinge holds. The way two people hold when they are the right two people and they have chosen each other with their whole selves and mean to keep choosing, day after day, for all the ordinary, extraordinary days ahead. It holds.